The chains were not there to restrain her. They were there to be seen. As the procession ground forward to the narrow streets of Rome, iron links scrape against stone with every step she took, a deliberate, rhythmic sound that cut through the roar of the crowd. The soldiers flanking her did not look at her face. Their eyes stayed forward, disciplined, trained by years of marching in formation, by campaigns that carried them across mountains and rivers, through burning towns and slaughtered armies. She was no longer a queen to them. She was a symbol being moved from the battlefield to the state. The general's chariot rolled ahead, crowned with laurel, the spoils of war stacked high for the citizens to see, armor stripped from defeated kings, banners torn from enemy standards, carts heavy with silver and gold. And behind it walked a woman whose name had once commanded loyalty from tens of thousands. Her hair had been loosened, her garments deliberately plain, her royal insignia removed by Roman hands days earlier. This was not improvisation. This was procedure. For Rome, victory did not end when the fighting stopped. Victory had to be demonstrated, performed, and recorded in memory. Roman soldiers understood this instinctively, because they had been raised inside a system where war was not only about killing the enemy, but about reshaping reality afterward. A captured queen was not merely a prisoner. She was a living proclamation that resistance had failed. Her survival was calculated. Her suffering was curated. By the late Republic and early Empire, Rome had perfected the art of conquest to a degree unmatched in the ancient world. Its legions were instruments of violence, yes, but also of administration, psychology, and law. When a city fell, soldiers did not simply loot at will. They acted within an understood framework. What could be taken, who could be killed, who must be preserved. High-status captives, especially royal women, were assets. Mishandling them could spark rebellions. Preserving them intact, however, carried dangers of its own. Queens embodied continuity. Dynasties survived through bloodlines, marriages, children. Even in defeat, a queen could become a rallying point, a bargaining chip, or a symbol of unfinished war. Roman commanders knew this. So did the Senate. So did the soldiers tasked with guarding these women once the battle dust settled. The moment of capture was often chaotic. Sieges collapsed inward, gates fell, and disciplined formations dissolved into violent confusion. Roman soldiers were trained to secure high-value targets amid the chaos. Royal residences were marked. Informants were questioned. Slaves were interrogated. A queen found alive was immediately surrounded, separated from her attendants, and placed under guard, not for her protection, but to preserve her value. From that point forward, her fate was no longer personal. It was political. Roman military law offered her no protection. She was not a citizen. She was not a soldier. She was not a civilian in the Roman sense. She existed in a legal void, classified as a captive enemy of exceptional status. This ambiguity allowed extraordinary latitude in how she was treated, particularly in the days between capture and formal transfer to a commanding general. It was during this period that the reality of Roman warfare became most apparent. Soldiers confiscated jewelry, crowns, ceremonial weapons. These were not thefts, they were inventory. Items were cataloged, divided, and sometimes reserved for triumphal display. Clothing was often replaced with simpler garments, not out of modesty, but to strip identity. Attendants were reassigned, sold, or killed depending on circumstance. Isolation was enforced with methodical efficiency. Roman soldiers understood isolation as a weapon. They used it on rebellious cities, on enemy commanders, and on captives whose morale they wished to break. A queen deprived of counsel, ritual, and familiarity became easier to control. More importantly, she became more malleable for what came next. The march toward Roman-controlled territory could last weeks or months. The route was deliberate, passing through allied cities and military camps where word spread ahead of her arrival. Soldiers ensured that she was visible, but not accessible. She was walked at a distance, guarded closely, spoken to rarely. The message was consistent. She was no longer a ruler negotiating terms. She was evidence of Rome's dominance. For the soldiers, this duty carried no glory. Guarding a captive queen did not earn extra pay or honors. It was monotonous, tense, and carried risks. Assassination attempts were not uncommon. Sympathizers might try to free her. Rival factions might attempt to kill her to prevent her use as a symbol. Roman discipline during these movements was strict. Failure to protect a captive could result in severe punishment. Yet there was no illusion of mercy. Soldiers knew, even if she did not, that survival to Rome often meant a longer ordeal. The triumph was the centerpiece of the system. A general awarded a triumph by the Senate was granted the right to parade his victory through the city in a sacred procession. Everything about it was regulated. The order, the participants, the timing. Captured kings and queens were integral to this ritual. Their presence transformed military success into civic religion. On the day of the triumph, soldiers took on a different role. They were no longer just warriors. They were stagehands of empire. They positioned captives, adjusted chains, enforced silence. The queen's humiliation was not spontaneous cruelty. It was choreography. Roman citizens needed to see her diminished. Allies needed to hear of it. Enemies needed to fear it. The crowd's reaction mattered less than the ritual itself. Some jeered. Some watched in silence. For Rome, the important thing was that the message was delivered. Even the highest-born enemies could be broken, displayed, and erased. What happened after the triumph varied, but rarely ended well. Some queens were executed shortly after, once their symbolic value was exhausted. Others were imprisoned indefinitely, kept alive but removed from public memory. A few vanished into forced marriages or exile, their identities dissolved into Roman domestic life, their names unrecorded. The soldiers who escorted them away did so with the same discipline they had shown on the battlefield. There were no speeches, no final gestures, just orders followed and doors closed. Rome did not need to explain itself. Its power spoke through process. And this is where the story truly begins, because behind the marble reliefs and polished histories lies a pattern that Roman writers preferred not to dwell on, a pattern of calculated degradation, psychological warfare, and state-sanctioned erasure carried out not by mobs, but by trained soldiers executing policy. In the next part, the focus tightens on specific queens whose fates expose the full mechanics of the system, and on the Roman military culture that made such outcomes not only possible, but by the time a captured queen reached Rome, the outcome was rarely in doubt, but the path toward it revealed the true nature of Roman power more clearly than any battlefield victory. The legions conquered territories, but the state conquered memory, and it did so through repetition, precedent, and carefully controlled violence. Roman soldiers were not ignorant of who these women were. Many had marched through lands where the queen's face appeared on coinage, where her name had been invoked in odes, where her lineage carried sacred weight. That knowledge was precisely why her treatment was so tightly regulated. Rome did not fear her strength in chains. It feared what she represented if handled incorrectly. One of the earliest and clearest examples comes from the late Republic, during Rome's wars in Gaul. When a Gallic queen was captured following the collapse of tribal resistance, her seizure followed a familiar pattern. Roman auxiliaries located her household after the defeat of her husband's forces. She was taken alive, not out of mercy, but because a dead queen offered Rome nothing. Alive, she could be displayed as proof that the gods favored Roman arms. Roman soldiers stripped her of ceremonial torque and bracelets, objects that had marked her status among her people. These were cataloged and sent ahead under guard, destined for the triumph. Her attendants were separated within hours. Some were sold. Some disappeared entirely. The queen herself was placed under the authority of the centurion, whose orders were explicit: preserve the captive, prevent escape, limit contact. The march south was slow and deliberate. Roman camps were disciplined environments, and her presence inside them was tightly controlled. She was housed apart, watched at all hours, never permitted privacy. This was not sadism. It was control. Roman doctrine emphasized breaking an enemy's will before any negotiation or display. For a queen accustomed to ritual, council, and public authority, silence and isolation were devastating. As the convoy crossed into Italy, the tone shifted further. The soldiers understood that she was no longer simply a prisoner of war. She was now property of the Roman state. Any mistreatment that might damage her appearance or undermine her usefulness was prohibited. Bruises would ruin the spectacle. Injuries would provoke questions. Her degradation had to be clean. The triumph that followed was meticulously staged. She was paraded behind the general's chariot, chains visible, posture enforced by guards trained to respond instantly to any deviation. Roman soldiers formed a cordon, preventing the crowd from approaching too closely. She was an object to be seen, not touched. Her humiliation was symbolic, not chaotic. Sources record that after the procession, she was executed. The method was not recorded in detail, which itself is telling. Roman historians often spared readers the specifics when violence was bureaucratic rather than heroic. What mattered was the outcome. The queen ceased to exist as a political entity. Her people were leaderless. Her name faded. This pattern repeated across centuries and theaters of war. In the Hellenistic East, where queens often wielded real administrative and military authority, Rome faced an even greater challenge. These women were educated, politically astute, and deeply embedded in dynastic networks that stretched across kingdoms. Capturing them intact was dangerous. Killing them too quickly risked destabilizing carefully managed client states. Roman soldiers assigned to guard eastern queens operated under stricter discipline. These captives were watched by multiple layers of authority: military officers, political envoys, sometimes even Senate representatives. Every interaction was monitored. Every movement was logged. The goal was containment without martyrdom. One such queen, taken after her husband's defeat in the civil war that Rome had engineered from the shadows, was held for years. She was never paraded publicly, never allowed to communicate with her former allies. Instead, she was kept in a kind of living erasure, alive but absent. Her continued existence prevented her immediate canonization as a martyr, while her isolation ensured she could not influence events. Roman soldiers rotated guard duty, enforcing silence and separation with the same rigor they applied to supply discipline. There was no room for improvisation. Compassion was not rewarded. Familiarity was discouraged. This was empire's routine. Not all queens were spared the spectacle. In some cases, Rome deliberately chose public humiliation as a deterrent. This was especially true in regions with a history of repeated rebellion. When a queen was known to have inspired resistance personally, her treatment was harsher, more visible, more final. In these cases, Roman soldiers became instruments of terror as much as order. They escorted captives through allied cities before reaching Rome, ensuring that news spread ahead of them. The queen's presence served as a warning. Resistance would not merely fail. It would be remembered in shame. Execution following triumph was reserved for these examples. It was not punishment. It was messaging. The mechanics of such executions were efficient and impersonal. Roman soldiers performed them away from crowds, often at night or within controlled enclosures. The body was disposed of quietly. There was no grave, no marker, no place for pilgrimage. Rome understood that memory required anchors, and it removed them systematically. What emerges from these accounts is not a picture of unrestrained brutality, but something colder and more unsettling. Roman soldiers were not acting on impulse or hatred. They were enforcing a system that reduced human lives to strategic variables. Queens were dangerous not because of what they could do physically, but because of what they symbolized. Rome responded by dismantling that symbolism piece by piece. The irony is that much of what we know about these women comes from the very culture that erased them. Roman historians wrote from the victor's perspective, framing these outcomes as necessary, inevitable, even just. The voices of the queens themselves are almost entirely absent. Their thoughts, fears, and resistance survive only in fragments, filtered through hostile sources. Yet even within those sources, the pattern is unmistakable. Captured queens were never treated as ordinary prisoners. They were subjected to a distinct process designed to neutralize not just their bodies, but their meaning. Roman soldiers, trained to follow orders without hesitation, were a final link in that process. By the time the chains were removed, there was nothing left for Rome to fear. In the final part, the focus shifts to the broader consequences of this practice, how it shaped Rome's imperial reputation, how it influenced later military doctrine, and why these stories remain uncomfortable, often omitted, yet essential to understanding how empires truly function. The system did not end with the death or disappearance of a single queen. It endured because it worked. Across generations, Roman commanders studied precedent as carefully as terrain. They knew which actions provoked rebellion and which extinguished it. The treatment of captured queens became part of that inherited knowledge, passed down not through manuals, but through example, Senate debate, and institutional memory. Roman soldiers did not need to be told why these women mattered. They saw the results in pacified provinces and quiet frontiers. In regions where Rome had publicly humiliated royal women, resistance often collapsed faster in subsequent campaigns. Tribal leaders negotiated sooner. Client kings proved more compliant. Rome's reputation preceded its legions, carried by merchants, envoys, and veterans settling in conquered lands. The message was unambiguous. Defiance would not merely end in defeat, but in the dismantling of identity itself. This had a profound psychological effect, not only on Rome's enemies, but on its own military culture. Soldiers came to understand that war did not end with victory cries or battlefield silence. It extended into courts, homes, bloodlines, and memory. Discipline was not simply about formation and obedience under fire. It was about restraint applied with precision, cruelty exercised selectively, and mercy denied strategically. Roman military doctrine began to reflect this broader conception of victory. Commanders emphasized the capture of leaders over indiscriminate slaughter. Intelligence networks expanded to identify royal households early in campaigns. Sieges were planned not just to breach walls, but to secure palaces intact. The fate of queens influenced operational decisions at the highest levels. Yet Rome paid a price for this efficiency. By reducing sovereignty to spectacle and fear, it fostered a legacy of resentment that never fully disappeared. Provinces pacified through humiliation remained brittle. Loyalty was often pragmatic, not heartfelt. When Roman power weakened centuries later, suppressed identities resurfaced with surprising force. Memories that Rome believed erased had merely been buried. Modern historians have struggled with these accounts. Ancient sources, written almost exclusively by Roman men of elite status, framed these practices as necessary statecraft. They praised restraint where modern readers might see calculated terror. They omitted details that disrupted Rome's self-image as a civilizing force. As a result, the experiences of captured queens exist mostly in the margins. Footnotes, fragments, hostile character sketches. Archaeology has offered little correction. Queens leave few traces once stripped of property and buried without markers. No monuments commemorate their endurance. No inscriptions preserve their voices. Silence, in this case, was a final weapon. What remains is pattern analysis. When accounts across centuries and regions align so closely, coincidence becomes impossible. Roman soldiers did not improvise these outcomes. They executed a model refined through trial and error, a model that balanced spectacle and secrecy, mercy and obliteration, survival and erasure. Understanding this forces a reassessment of Roman military professionalism. Discipline and innovation were real. Tactical brilliance and logistical mastery were undeniable. But so was a willingness to weaponize humiliation with bureaucratic calm. The same system that built roads and aqueducts perfected methods of psychological annihilation. For modern audiences accustomed to romanticized visions of Rome, this reality is uncomfortable. It challenges the notion of honorable conquest and exposes the cost paid by those who stood at the intersection of gender, power, and defeat. Captured queens were not collateral damage. They were targets, selected precisely because of who they were. Roman soldiers, often admired for their discipline and resilience, were also agents of this process. Not monsters, not sadists, but professionals operating within an empire that valued results above morality. Their efficiency made the system possible. Their obedience made it reliable. In the end, Rome did not just conquer territories. It conquered narratives. By controlling how defeat was displayed and remembered, it shaped history itself. The queens who vanish into chains and silence remind us that empire is not sustained by battles alone, but by what happens afterward, when the sword is sheathed and the crowds gather. If this account forced you to confront an uncomfortable side of Roman power, if it challenged the myths that often surround ancient warfare, then this story has served its purpose. Military history is not only about tactics and triumphs, but about systems, consequences, and the human cost hidden behind marble reliefs and victory arches.